Guessing. So this is a really boring slide. Melding curated narrative into the roguelike structure, which is a fancy way for me to say that curated narrative, like you would think writing a book or writing a screenplay or anything like that, actually has a place in roguelikes. And that's basically what I'm going to kind of justify. And hopefully if I hit this. Oh, there we go. So who the heck am I? My name is Tim Keenan. I made a game called Duskers. Thank you. Wow, cool. This is my audience, right? It's just like, yeah, so Duskers is, if you haven't heard of it, it is a game where you pilot drones into derelict spaceships to try and figure out why everybody's dead. And so I felt when I was making this game, a big part of that was that atmosphere, right? Like, why is everybody dead? And I feel, in general, curated narrative is important because when I read a book, like that author, in theory, can write a really good story, and I can take that in, and that's what they're really good at. But I know that a lot of us here in the games industry feel kind of like the little brother to a lot of other industries, and so the response that one would get would be, why bother, right? Because the player story is king, and I love the player story, and there's nothing wrong with that. But like, yeah, thank you. But like, so like, why not have no story and then have me explore this world and do my own things and not ever have, you know, a cutscene interrupt me or a quick time event or whatever. And to be fair, I'm not talking about any of that stuff. But so this is kind of the, you know, the shrug off of curated narrative. And the thing that I would say is the reason you would want a curated narrative in a roguelike is the same way you would want a curated narrative in any game, right? If you see the value in that, I see that it gives you these like mid-term and long-term goals. It gives you mystery. It gives you like this compelling question, hopefully, like what happened to everybody. And hopefully that is something that adds instead of subtracts from the experience. So something where you can go and explore all these derelict spaceships and never ever wonder what happened to everybody, because who cares? They're not my family, like they're gone, whatever. Or if you do care, or you've been playing for 10, 20 hours, and then all of a sudden you're just like, hey, you know what? I haven't run into anybody. What's going on here? Then you could actually start paying attention to that. This all goes into this notion, and at my GDC talk, I talked a lot about cohesive design. And I think the reason that people don't like curated narrative in roguelikes is because it's either done poorly or poorly. And that's a really rude way of saying that basically they're not thinking about how to integrate that into the structure. And I'm not saying I did it right. I'm saying I tried to do it, and I'm going to show you what we did. I don't think we nailed it by any stretch of the imagination, because my Steam forums are not filled with people being like, wow, you really nailed the story in this one. But I think that we tried. This analogy is really weird. This is in Finding Nemo, when all the fish swim in the same direction, and basically the net goes down and they have to cut it loose. And so my analogy here is that if your story is 10 of these fish, it could be swimming in any direction, not really helping the game, or it could be swimming up and really working against it. And so the thought is that if everything is driving in the same direction, that's what's powerful. So you want your story, your curated story, to be integrated in a very organic way into the roguelike structure. So how do you do that? So let's talk about a couple problems that the roguelikes have with this kind of narrative curated thing that I saw. One of them is the repetitive nature of a roguelike, right? You do a thing, you die, you do a thing, you die, right? So if I have this long-winded intro cutscene, and then you have to go through that every time you play, that would obviously suck. And then the other way that you can do that is like, oh, I have the long intro scene, and then I don't have that again, but it's as if it happened, but you just remember it. But I was trying to go further than that. So what we did, and now I get to bring up Jim's Metapresence? Yes, Metapresence. I had no idea I had Metapresence. I feel like a guru right now. But basically what I decided is I am one of the people that didn't yell out because I'm a coward, that is one of those, like, all right, forget persistence in roguelikes. However, I am fine with it when it has nothing to do with gameplay. I am one of those, oh, the first time I wanted to be just as challenged as I am the last time, or whatever. So what we tried to do is make the narrative persistent in the game. So when you find logs and you find out information, we don't pretend like you died and you went back. We do a lot of weird sci-fi stuff with that probably no one's paying attention to, but metaverses and stuff like that, where like you actually still keep those logs. So you are still going, and you are still remembering that. And what he's talking about with the player remembers, I don't want to fake the funk and be like, well, the player remembers, but the person I'm playing isn't. The person you're playing in Duskers is you. You're behind the command line. You're on the keyboard. So I wanted it to be you. So I wanted to acknowledge the fact that you still know everything that you knew before. Another problem is that the story isn't unique to you. This is what's this shows how old I am. This is the first thing that came to mind. Was Simply Irresistible. This is an 80s song. I don't know if anybody here is as old as me. But the story is not unique to you, right? The problem is that like I don't want to go through and be like at the water cooler and be like, oh yeah, did the bridge blow up at the exact second that you were walking by because the dragon flew under? Like that's not as fun. That's what we love about roguelikes. We love that procedural generation. We love that unique thing. I am a special snowflake, right? And so how do we attack this? Right? So what we did was we tried to make the narrative more procedural. And by this, I don't mean the like holy grail of like a computer is writing the story and it's an awesome story. Like someday we'll get there and then many of us will probably be out of a job. But for now, it's like, how do you integrate that? So what we did was we tried to tie the story into the procedural elements of the game. So for example, a lot of this game is about existential risk and why everybody's dead, right? So what we did was, like, one example was one theory was that maybe it was this weird cosmic event that happened. So one of the objectives that you had as you uncovered all these logs was to find a very old derelict and bring it to a research station so that you could compare it to the data that they had from more recent derelicts or something like that. And so what's really cool about this is that on one run, you might find a research station and be like, oh my God, this is great. Now I'm going to mark that on this map, and now I'm going to try and find the other piece of this puzzle. And while I'm going through the universe, I'm going to try and find all the upgrades I need to commandeer an old ship, right? But another time when you're playing through, it might be the opposite. Either you don't find that, or you find the really old ship, and now all of a sudden you're like, oh man, if I can commandeer this, and you do it correctly, now you're cruising through the system looking for this research station on this ship that might not be ideal to cruise around in. And so these are ways that, like, with the same exact story, you're getting two different experiences. Another thing that kind of happens with this is this really cool word, apothenia, which is basically us looking at clouds and being like, okay, instead of that just being a random thing, oh, that's a unicorn, right? So the idea is that sometimes we make sense out of random data, and we can use this to our advantage. RimWorld does this better than anything, I think. So one thing we decided to do was, what if we put the logs out of order? Like, does that change your perception of this stuff? And it turns out it might. So what we did was we had one of the existential risks was gray goo, which is basically nano machines replicating and forever, and then everything ends up being goo. So what we did was we made a log where one scientist was complaining that there was a dead rat, that like half of it was gelatinous material, and that it was near a replicator, and so something might be going awry. And another log was two operators, seemingly not continual, but complaining that like every time an animal or anything dies on a space station, they get a call from a scientist being like, replicators are going crazy and everyone's gonna die, right? So we made a website and we gave a survey, and when you load the website up, it gives you those two logs in random order, right? And we just asked, how concerning is this dead rat? And so the people that read the scientist complaining and then the two operators making fun of him, they were like, that's a concern because they're not listening to him. And the people that were like, oh, they were making fun of these scientists, oh, and here's the lame scientist that's complaining about it, that's not really as much of a concern. So the idea is that like by shifting around the order that you guys read things and the events in the order that they happen, you can start to change their perception of it, even though the curated narrative is the same. You're integrating it into the structure really well. To be completely fair, as more and more people took this, these numbers started just kind of going all over the place. So I'm making it like this is some brilliant research, and it's not at all. Small asterisk. So another problem is that the narrative starts to feel constrained, right? Like, oh, I know that I've got to find an old derelict, and bring it to a research station, and that's all I have to do. And even though I know there's plenty of other world to explore, I'm so focused on that. So the way that we handled that was by making multiple branching storylines that you could attack if you want or not. So at the same time that you were doing that, you stumbled onto this idea that maybe there was a pandemic that happened. And so what they wanted, the idea was that to lure one of these alien creatures into your docking bay and scan it. And that requires you to have certain upgrades and certain conditions met, as do all the other things that you would have to do. So now when you start your game, instead of being like, I gotta go to A, and then I gotta go to B, and then I gotta go to C, it's like, there's a lot of different things to do, and it might be that on your run you feel really lucky because you landed in a system that happens to have something that works really well for the pandemic thing. And on your next run, oh my God, there's an old derelict, so I'm gonna try and accomplish what is essentially achievements. I basically took like achievements and like built them into the story. But that way you always feel like there's lots to do, and the ordering and all that stuff, like all that stuff being a really weird way to end that sentence. But I hope you get what I'm saying is that like you can take these curated bits and integrate them into the structure while still having really cool prose and really cool stories that were written out, but then somewhat feel like each player has a unique experience with them. But yeah, so that's the idea. I don't know how long that took, and I don't know if we have time for questions. I'm guessing we do. I guess I keep this one. You think that one? How long was it? Wow, that was fast. Yeah. Damn.
So we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Does anyone have a question they want to ask? Yes.
Way in the back there.
I think this is a great concept. I'm curious how you plan to use it in your future work. Are you gonna, did you like it and you're gonna do it again in the next game? How will you change your approach from Duskers, and where are you gonna take this?
So I actually really love this approach because it was really fun for me. I'm a storyteller, and so for me to be able to tell a story but not feel like I'm putting everybody on rails and like kind of have my cake and eat it too. I think if I had to be completely honest with myself, one of the ways that I think it might have failed is the fact that we had all these storylines, and I felt like bringing them all back to the singular point would kind of ruin it, because then that would be like, oh, the game is over, which it's a roguelike, so I felt that worked against the structure. But I do know a lot of players really rallied against that. They wanted to have that button on the end where they were like, that was the thing that did it. And so I brought each storyline to a sense of closure, but I didn't wrap them all up nicely. And that's an artistic thing. I can't blame myself for that. I don't think that was wrong, but I definitely know that the community, I think would have preferred us to do something where there was a resolution. So I think if I was going to do it again, I might try that, and then if it doesn't work out, then just own it that some people aren't going to like it. But I think that would be, I don't know, from what the community was saying, I feel like that would have been a fun thing to do.
Since you can assume that the player is going to play the game multiple times and die multiple times, have you experimented at all with, or how did you actually integrate the story? Like, are there parts that will just never show up due to random generation and you have to play multiple times to get it all, or did you try to throw everything in there as part of the mechanic?
Yeah, so I kind of fault, and maybe this is what Ben was talking about with chaos. I kind of enjoy that in the randomness. So I feel like there was real pressure for me to start the game out with this learning curve where, this earlier systems were a lot easier and then later systems were a lot harder, and then maybe make it that they got these beats. And the thing that I found personally was the more random I made it, every now and then there was a bad case, right? Where someone would be upset because it was too hard too early, or they got things in a random order. But the more I embraced it, the more that brings out better player stories. So when your second system is really hard, that is exciting because it's the last time I played it, the second system was easy and I just assumed that. Right? And now all of a sudden there was this one run where it was really hard, but I got through and I barely had, I only had 2 drones left and I thought I was going to die. And I think that's when Duskers and a lot of roguelikes are brilliant, is when you're at that point where you're I'm going to die, and you figure out some clever way to get past it and then quickly die. But you have that story where you survived, right? And I think it's the same way with the story. So I actually had a secondary backbone story that was more not related to what you were doing, and I was going to dole them out in order to kind of give you the gist of this weird place we were taking you. And then we just were like, everything that we randomize is fun. What if we randomize these things? And this was a linear story, and this was scary to me because. And then I shuffled the papers and I gave it to one person and I did it and I gave it to another. And they had completely different interpretations of what was going on. And I was like, I love it. So, and this is part of why we make roguelikes, right? Is to just sit on our forums and be like, wait, what happened? Like, you did what? Why? Why did you do that? That's so cool and weird. And so to hear different people with different theories about what's going on is part of the fun. So that was really exciting for me. I hope that answers the question a little bit. But yeah. And then the one last thing I wanted to add is that another part of this game, like kind of leading from what you were saying, is that I didn't want to force anybody into my story if they didn't want to. So you wander about and you might stumble upon a log that's really interesting, and you can just ignore it. And if you do, then that's fine. You can go around and play with all these ships. But if you don't, you could be like, oh my God, there's a military conspiracy going on right now. Next time I see a military ship, I'm going to beeline for it, you know? And that factors into your strategy.
I'm curious, since most of these story elements and stuff sort of happened in the past and you're recovering the logs from them, is there anything that you would think to do differently if you were encountering these things in real time as they were happening, and like how that would necessarily affect the approach?
Yeah, that would affect the approach a lot, right? Because that would mean that your actions would be having hopefully, would be having direct consequence with them. And this is really interesting. Like, everything is like dominoes, right? Like, everything really affects itself. So sometimes when I'm designing a game, I'd make these decisions on purpose. Like, I was like, I didn't want to have NPCs because, to me, one of the emotional pillars of this game is that you were isolated and this felt real to you. And so if there was an NPC that was talking, inherently you would know it wasn't real because our AI just isn't that good. So that's why I wanted you to find the logs. So that was a conscious decision. So if it wasn't logs and this was like current day, if one of my pillars wasn't realism, that would be much better, right? Because then all of a sudden, the player in the back of their mind is like, that's okay, I'm in this fantasy world. But then you would have to take that stuff into account. What we did do to a small degree was it did matter. We had in the logs built in like a little like markup language so that we could replace things. So that if you found a spaceship that had a doctor that had done some famous thing or something, or was doing research and you wanted to know the result of that, then we would insert the ship name, and then that would be procedurally placed somewhere in the world. And so you would have to go find that. So we started doing things like that so that your actions and the procedural nature was more current. And I think that was really cool. And what we had to accept was the fact that when you started over again, it was sort of like a metaverse idea. So we replaced that with a new ship name. And you had to recognize and that was a little trip too for people when they'd go back and they'd be like, I'm looking for the what? And that started to realize that like things were changing slightly. But that was also really fun because that would change where it was and how it was. So we started to play a little bit with that, but definitely the fact that everything had already happened was a benefit, a huge benefit. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.